It was a few months after my grandfather passed away when my family decided to go through his belongings. He had been a private man, keeping most of his life to himself, so we weren't sure what we'd find. My mother, father, and I spent an entire weekend sifting through old boxes, faded letters, and countless knickknacks. Among the items, we found an old, dusty photo album tucked away in a corner of his attic. The album was filled with black and white photographs, most of them taken decades ago. There were pictures of family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and everyday moments from long before I was born. The images felt like a glimpse into a different era, a world that seemed distant and foreign despite being so intimately tied to our family. As we flipped through the pages, we reminisced about the people in the photos, some of whom I had never met. The attic, usually musty and stale, felt almost alive with the memories we were uncovering. Then we came across a photograph that none of us had seen before. It was a picture of my grandfather, much younger, standing in front of a large, unfamiliar house. He was smiling, but there was something odd about the image. In the window of the house, behind him, there was a figure, a woman dressed in a long, dark dress, staring directly at the camera. Her face was pale and expressionless, and her eyes seemed to follow us as we moved the album. The more I looked at her, the more unsettled I felt, as if her gaze was reaching through the photograph and into the present. My mother gasped when she saw the woman. "That's her," she whispered. "That's the woman he used to talk about." I looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" She explained that my grandfather had always mentioned a mysterious woman he would see in his dreams. He claimed she was always standing in the background, watching him silently. He never knew who she was or why she appeared, but he had been convinced that she was real. My mother had always brushed it off as a figment of his imagination, perhaps a ghost from his past that he couldn't let go of. But now, seeing her in this photograph, the reality of her existence seemed undeniable. We continued to stare at the photograph, unable to shake the uneasy feeling it gave us. The woman's presence in the picture felt wrong, almost as if she didn't belong there. But the more I looked at her, the more familiar she seemed, as if I had seen her before. I couldn't place where or when, but something about her was hauntingly recognizable. It was like a memory just out of reach, something I knew but couldn't quite grasp. My father, who had been silent up until this point, finally spoke up. "We should put this away," he said, his voice tense. "There's no point in dwelling on it." Reluctantly, we closed the album and placed it back in the box. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the photograph. I tossed and turned in bed, her image seared into my mind. The more I tried to push it away, the more vividly it returned, as if she was refusing to be forgotten. Eventually, I drifted off into a restless sleep, but even then, I couldn't escape her. That's when the dreams started. In my dream, I was standing in front of the same house from the photograph. The sky was overcast, and the air was thick with tension. The house loomed before me, its windows dark and foreboding. I walked towards it, feeling an inexplicable pull to go inside. As I reached the door, it creaked open on its own, and I stepped into the dimly lit foyer. The air was cold, and the house felt eerily quiet, as if it had been abandoned for years. Yet, there was something almost welcoming about it, as though it had been waiting for me. I walked through the empty rooms, each one more decayed than the last. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture was covered in dust, and the floorboards creaked under my feet. But despite the decay, there was a sense of familiarity, as if I had been there before. The layout of the house, the way the light filtered through the dirty windows, even the smell of the damp, rotting wood, it all felt disturbingly recognizable, like a place I had once known well. As I approached the staircase, I felt a presence behind me. I turned around slowly, and there she was, the woman from the photograph. She was standing at the top of the stairs, her eyes locked onto mine. She didn't move, didn't say a word, but her gaze was enough to freeze me in place. I wanted to run, to wake up, but I was paralyzed by fear. Her eyes, cold and unblinking, bore into me with an intensity that felt almost tangible, as if she was trying to communicate something through sheer will. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The dream felt too real, too vivid to be just a nightmare. It was as if the woman had reached out to me, trying to make contact from beyond the grave. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to tell me something, but what? And why now, after all these years? The next morning, I told my parents about the dream. My mother looked shaken, but my father dismissed it as just a result of our recent discovery. However, I knew there was something more to it. The woman in the photograph wasn't just a dream, and she wasn't just a figment of my grandfather's imagination. She was real, and she was trying to tell us something. The dream felt like a warning, or perhaps a plea for help, but I couldn't decipher its meaning. Over the next few days, the dreams continued. Each night, I found myself back in that house, wandering its empty halls and decaying rooms. The woman was always there, sometimes watching me from a distance, other times appearing suddenly, her face inches from mine. She never spoke, but her presence was suffocating, as if she was demanding my attention, urging me to understand something I couldn't quite grasp. During the day, I became obsessed with the photograph. I couldn't stop thinking about it, replaying the image in my mind over and over again. The house, the woman, my grandfather's eerie connection to it all, it consumed my thoughts. I found myself drawn to the attic, to the box where we had stored the album. I needed to see it again, to try and make sense of the inexplicable events that had begun to unfold. When I finally gave in and retrieved the album, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. The photograph of the house, which had previously shown my grandfather alone with the woman in the window, had changed. Now, there were two figures standing on the front porch beside him. Two children, a boy and a girl, their faces blurred and indistinct. They weren't in the photo when we first found it, I was certain of that. But there they were, as if they had always been part of the scene. I showed the altered photograph to my parents, but my father dismissed it as a trick of the light or a flaw in the old film. My mother, on the other hand, was visibly disturbed. She couldn't explain it, but she knew, as I did, that something wasn't right. The children's appearance in the photograph felt like a new piece of a puzzle we didn't have the ability to solve. Who were they? And why were they now part of this haunting image? As the days passed, the dreams became more intense. The house was no longer just a backdrop. It was alive, its walls whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear. The woman's presence grew stronger, more insistent, as if she was trying to break through the barrier between our worlds. And the children, they were always there now, standing silently in the background, their blurred faces watching me with a sadness that was almost palpable. One night, after another unsettling dream, I woke up to find the album on my bedside table. I was sure I had left it in the attic, yet there it was, open to the photograph of the house. The children's faces were no longer blurred. They were clear, and they were looking directly at me. Their eyes, filled with a mixture of fear and desperation, seemed to plead with me to understand their plight. I could feel their sorrow, their pain, as if it were my own. That night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I heard a faint sound coming from the attic. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on the floor above. The sound sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't bring myself to investigate. Instead, I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent, until it suddenly stopped, leaving the house in an oppressive silence. The next morning, I went to the attic, driven by a mixture of dread and curiosity. As I climbed the creaky stairs, I could feel the air grow colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. When I reached the top, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The box where we had stored the album was open, its contents scattered across the floor. And in the center of the room, where the box had been, was a small, old-fashioned doll. A doll I had never seen before, dressed in the same long, dark dress as the woman in the photograph. I picked up the doll, my hands trembling. It was cold to the touch, its fabric worn and frayed as if it had been there for decades. The doll's glass eyes, eerily lifelike, stared blankly ahead, reflecting the dim light filtering through the attic window. As I held it, I felt a strange, overwhelming sense of sadness wash over me, as if the doll itself carried the weight of countless sorrows. I couldn't explain it, but I knew the doll was connected to the woman in the photograph. There was a sense of familiarity about it, like I had seen it somewhere before, yet I couldn't recall where or when. I I turned the doll over in my hands, searching for any clue that might explain its presence, but there was nothing. No markings, no signs of origin, nothing to indicate how it had ended up in my grandfather's attic. As I stood there, holding the doll, the attic grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen around me. I could feel a presence, the same unsettling feeling that had plagued me since we found the photograph. It was as if the woman was there with me, watching, waiting for me to uncover the truth. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out of the attic and never return. But something kept me rooted to the spot, a compulsion to understand what was happening, to piece together the fragments of this haunting puzzle. I placed the doll back in the box, carefully tucking it away among the scattered items. But as I did, my hand brushed against something cold and metallic. I pulled it out and found an old key, its surface tarnished with age. The key was small, delicate, and looked like it would fit an antique lock. I had never seen it before, but somehow I knew it was important. There was something about the key that felt connected to the house in the photograph, as if it could unlock a door to whatever secrets the woman and the children were hiding. That night, I dreamt of the house again, but this time, it was different. The air was thick with a sense of dread, and the sky above was a swirling mass of dark clouds, blocking out any light. I stood before the house, clutching the key in my hand, and felt the same pull to enter as before. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, but this time, I wasn't alone. The woman was there, standing in the foyer, her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. She raised her hand and pointed to a door at the end of the hallway, a door I hadn't noticed in my previous dreams. The key in my hand grew warm, as if reacting to her silent command. I knew I was supposed to open that door, to use the key and uncover whatever lay beyond. But the fear that gripped me was almost paralyzing. I didn't want to know what was behind that door, didn't want to face the horrors I could feel lurking just out of sight. But the woman's gaze held me, compelling me to move forward. My feet carried me down the hallway, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The door loomed before me, its surface cracked and weathered. With trembling hands, I inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. I hesitated, peering into the black void below. The air that wafted up from the stairs was cold and damp, carrying the scent of earth and decay. Every instinct told me to turn back, to run as far from this place as I could. But something, whether it was the woman's presence or my own morbid curiosity, drove me to descend the stairs. As I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, dimly lit basement. The walls were lined with old, crumbling shelves, and in the center of the room was a large wooden chest, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. I knew, without a doubt, that this chest was the source of the mystery that had haunted my family. The woman, the children, the dreams, they all led to this moment. I approached the chest, my heart pounding in my ears. As I reached out to open it, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I froze, too terrified to turn around. The air grew even colder, and I could hear the faint whispers of voices, too quiet to make out. Slowly, I turned, expecting to see the woman standing behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty, cold darkness of the basement. Gathering what little courage I had left, I turned back to the chest and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in tattered cloth, were more photographs. Old, faded images of the house, the woman, and the children. But there was something else, too, an old diary, its cover cracked and worn. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hands, and opened it to the first page. The diary belonged to my grandfather. His handwriting was shaky and uneven, and the entries were filled with ramblings about the woman, the children, and the house. He wrote of dreams that haunted him, of seeing the woman standing at the foot of his bed, of hearing the children's voices echoing through the halls of the house. He wrote of how the dreams became more vivid, more terrifying, until he could no longer tell where the dreams ended and reality began. The final entry was dated just days before his death. In it, he wrote of a terrible realization that the woman and the children were not just figments of his imagination, but spirits trapped in the house, bound by some tragic event that had taken place long ago. He believed they were reaching out to him, trying to communicate, to be freed from their torment. But he didn't know how to help them, and the fear of what they might want had driven him to hide the photographs and the diary, hoping to escape their reach. As I read the last words, the basement grew colder, and I could feel the presence of the woman and the children surrounding me. They were there, waiting for me to finish what my grandfather could not. The diary slipped from my hands, and I could hear the faint, desperate whispers growing louder, pleading with me to understand, to help them. I knew then that I couldn't leave, not without facing whatever horrors lay in the house. I had to uncover the truth, to find a way to free these tortured spirits from their eternal suffering. But as I stood in that dark basement, surrounded by the echoes of the past, I couldn't help but wonder if I was already too late. If, like my grandfather, I was doomed to be haunted by the ghost in the photograph for the rest of my life.